Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the incredible story of how a single piece of paper, the US dollar, became maybe the most powerful economic weapon in the entire world. It's a fascinating tale of gold, of oil, and a global power play that, believe it or not, affects every single one of us. So let's just jump right in with a pretty wild question. How can a piece of paper, a currency, actually be used as a weapon? I mean, how can it bring entire nations to their knees, sometimes even more effectively than a full-blown army? And, that really leads to the even bigger mystery here. Why? Why has the whole world become so completely dependent on this one single currency? What happened to create a system where pretty much every country on Earth has to play by the dollar's rules? Okay, to really get this, we first have to see the dollar's power in action right now, today. It's all done through a system that some people have called a financial nuclear bomb. Let's break down how it actually works. It all kicks off with this thing called SWIFT. Now, the easiest way to think about SWIFT is like a super secure WhatsApp for the entire world's banking system. It doesn't physically move any money, but it sends the payment instructions. And without those instructions, well, absolutely nothing moves. So you can imagine getting kicked off this network is a really big deal. And because the US has a ton of influence over SWIFT, it can basically cut a country like Russia or Iran off from the entire global financial system. It is a truly devastating economic blow. But how on earth did we get to a point where just one country holds that much power? To understand that, we have to rewind the clock, I'm talking thousands of years, all the way back to the very beginnings of trade itself. So, trade started out super simple, right? Just bartering. But that gets really inefficient really fast. So societies moved on to precious metals, and then to this key innovation, paper notes that actually represented real metal held safely in a bank. This made trade way faster, a whole lot safer, and just easier to do on a massive scale. And this system eventually became what we call the gold standard. The rule was simple, and it created a lot of trust. A country couldn't just print money out of thin air. Nope. Every single dollar bill or pound or franc it printed had to be backed by a real physical amount of gold sitting in its vaults. Now, for a very, very long time, the undisputed king of this gold-backed world was not the US dollar. The global reserve currency actually belonged to a massive European empire. Back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the British pound sterling was the dominant force, no question. It was so trusted, so widespread, that it was used in a staggering 60% of all international trade. The entire world basically ran on the pound. But the pound's reign was just completely shattered by two world wars. The first one drained Britain's gold reserves dry, and during the second, Germany deliberately counterfeited pound notes just to destroy global trust in the currency. The king was dethroned, and that left a massive power vacuum. So as Europe was lying in ruins, one country, physically untouched by the wars and economically supercharged, saw this once-in-a-lifetime chance to completely rewrite the rules of the global economy. And this really shows you just how dominant the US had become. By the time World War II ended, while all these other nations were basically broke, the United States held an incredible 70% of the entire world's gold supply. Just let that number sink in for a second. Over 22,000 tons of gold. So how did they do it? Well, by staying neutral at first and acting as the, arsenal for the Allied powers, selling them weapons, supplies, food, all in exchange for their gold. So, with all the gold in its vaults and the rest of the world desperate to rebuild, the stage was perfectly set. The US was in the absolute perfect position to create a new financial system, with its currency right at the very center of it. And so, in 1944, leaders from 44 nations got together at a place called Bretton Woods and agreed to a revolutionary new system. Instead of every country backing its own currency with its own gold, they would now back their currencies with the US dollar, which in turn was backed by America's gigantic hoard of gold. Then, just 1 year later, the US made another brilliant strategic move. It struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, which was the world's new oil superpower. The deal was simple. In exchange for full military protection, the Saudis agreed to sell their oil, the lifeblood of the global economy, only in US dollars. And this was the birth of what we now call the petrodollar system. Now, this system actually worked for a couple of decades, but by the 1970s, the US had printed way more dollars than it actually had gold to back them up. So, facing a run on its reserves, President Nixon made this stunning announcement that just sent shockwaves around the entire world. With that one move, the US completely, unilaterally broke the promise of Bretton Woods. The dollar was no longer convertible to gold. This event kicked off our modern era of fiat currencies, money that's backed only by trust, not a physical thing. But here's the kicker. Because of that petrodollar system, the world had no other choice. It was trapped. To buy oil, you still needed dollars. And if you look at history, it shows a very clear and often brutal pattern for anyone who tried to challenge this system. Leaders in Iraq, Libya, and Iran all attempted to sell their oil in other currencies. And in each case, they faced invasion, overthrow, or just crippling sanctions. This absolute dominance has really defined geopolitics for half a century. But today, right now, for the first time in a very long time, the dollar's throne is facing some serious and coordinated challenges from all around the globe. This is what people are calling de-dollarization. Major economic powers are actively setting up systems to trade with each other directly, completely bypassing the dollar. And the reasons are complicated: avoiding U.S. sanctions, creating more efficient trade, and really just asserting their own economic independence. From Russia and China to Saudi Arabia and India, countries are looking for alternatives. The two alternatives you hear about the most are the Chinese yuan, which is slowly gaining some ground, and a potential new shared currency from the BRICS alliance of major emerging economies. Now, both of these face huge hurdles, things like global trust and convertibility, but the intention to create a new kind of financial world is definitely there. And all this leaves us with one final big question. The US dollar has been the undisputed king for 80 years, and it survived countless crises. But are we now seeing the first real signs of the end of an era? Or will the dollar, once again, just prove that it's impossible to replace?